Hello and welcome to another video review. This is King's Quest VII: The Princeless Bride for PC and Mac. This is the follow-up to King's Quest VI, aired today, gone tomorrow. It was released in 1994, and it was kind of interesting because the response to it was not what you'd expect from a King's Quest game. Mostly because even though it was still a point-and-click adventure game, they changed up a lot with this one. And so you have to wonder, were the changes good, or did they not work out all that well, or why was there such a reaction to King's Quest VII? It certainly wasn't the art style, was it? I mean, you can tell right off the bat that this looks nothing like any of the previous King's Quest games. The art style is radically different. Most of what you're seeing is, of course, cartoon, but it's also on painted backgrounds. And there's some CG effects in there, too. Some 3D CG effects, like the Silver Dragon. Which, these effects look pretty bad, to be honest with you. I mean, they were okay for the time. It was something new and different. But at the same time, they contrast with the cartoony animations of the characters and such like that. And it just looks really odd. When you combine that with the fact that the animations for the characters and everything are really sluggish and seem odd and unnatural, and there's, even though they were supposed to be able to put more detail into this art style, and you'd think just from looking at it at a glance that it would look better, when you actually look at it, it doesn't look as good as the previous King's Quest game. Which doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it? I mean, that was much more pixelated. But there's just something weird about the cartoony drawings in this game that makes them look really odd and unnatural. Now, it is still very colorful. It does still give off this very fairy tale-esque vibe in terms of its visuals, but it's a very jarring effect, and it's not something you're used to with King's Quest. Sierra would go on to do this again with Space Quest VI, and it was to a much better degree in that one because they made the animations smoother and everything. So this was almost a trial run, at least it feels like, for this art style, and it certainly had a few missteps in that regard. As for the rest of the presentation, the sound effects are basically what you'd find on a Saturday morning cartoon. They aren't particularly impressive, and that even though they are certainly more detailed than the previous games, they just seem odd and too wacky for something like King's Quest. The music isn't bad, but it doesn't really do anything to help the overall presentation, because even though the music isn't bad, it's not particularly memorable for the most part, and it does have that kind of fairy tale-esque vibe, but it really just, again, doesn't help in the long run. And then you have the voice acting. I don't know what happened between King's Quest VI and King's Quest VII, but the voice acting in King's Quest VII is often outright terrible. And it really doesn't help that your two main characters, Valenice and Rosella, just are really, really whiny the entire game. So that just gets annoying. And even though the voice acting is certainly better than many other games that I've heard over the years, it's certainly going from King's Quest VI to VII in terms of the voice acting is just really jarring. So the presentation, while it's not terrible, is certainly a, oddly enough, a step down from King's Quest VI, even though the technology is better. It's just a very odd thing going from 6 to 7 when you have these really high production values in 6, and you go to 7, and it's just nowhere near as good in terms of presentation. But the presentation isn't what really matters about King's Quest VII. What really matters are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this one is odd, because it's not like any King's Quest game you've played up to now. Instead, it's divided into 6 chapters. Each of these chapters basically follows a different character. First chapter, it's Queen Valenice. Yes, you're playing as Queen Valenice in this chapter. Wow! This is new. This is exciting. This gives us new possibilities, right? And then you also play as Rosella in other chapters of the game as well. You switch between these characters depending on which chapter you're in. And it's kind of cool because not only does Rosella get her second adventure like Alexander got his second adventure, but we actually get to see Valenice in an important role for a change. And unfortunately, though, Valenice is not a good character. And you discover very, very quickly why she has not had her own adventures up until now. She's annoying. And the beginning of this game is just completely full of people whining. In the first chapter, it's Valenice whining about how she's been separated from Rosella, which was caused by her, I might add. Basically what ended up happening was Rosella was off just wandering around in the forest, basically, and whining about how Queen Valenice is trying to push this, hey, you need to get married stuff on Rosella. And Valenice is following her and trying to persuade her. And eventually Rosella sees this image in a pond and decides, hey, I'm going to jump into this pond and see if it teleports me. I guess. I don't know why she jumps in the pond, actually, just from the beginning. It doesn't really make any sense. What, did she assume that it would be a portal? I don't know. But Valenice follows her in, and of course they get separated. Valenice falls into a desert, whereas Rosella falls into the kingdom of trolls, basically. In so doing, Rosella gets turned into a troll. This is Chapter 2, by the way. Chapter 1, where Valenice has fallen into a desert, is basically her trying to get out of the desert. And the entire time she is whining about how she's been separated from Rosella and how everything is just sucky. And then you get to Chapter 2, and it's Rosella whining about how she's been turned into a troll. Yeah, there's a lot of whining in this game. But it moves on into different diverging paths of the story. Part of the story is Valenice basically trying to reunite with Rosella. And the other part is Rosella trying to investigate what's going on with the trolls. Rosella's parts are much more interesting, because she's dealing with the actual plot of the game, which is that there's this evil wizard person, sorceress I guess is the best term, who is trying to start up a volcano and thus wipe out people. Why? Because she can. No, really, she doesn't have any motivation. She's just evil. I mean, even in the previous games, they had reasons. They were either power-hungry, or they were seeking revenge, or something like that. But no, in this case, she's just evil. Okay, whatever. But suffice to say, Rosella's immediately being thrown into that and trying to deal with that. And on top of that, she's trying to find a way to turn back into a human, because she's been turned into a troll. Meanwhile, Valenice is trying to reunite with Rosella, and in so doing, she's also trying to basically restore the land to some degree. And the problem with this story is that even though you have these two paths of the storyline that are distinct, and you can tell what they're going for with each of them, eventually the stories just are so fragmented and so all over the place in where you're going and what you're doing that you're just sitting there going, wait, what? And so as a result, the game ends up coming across as like they had a barrel of ideas that were rejected from all of the previous King's Quest games, and they said, okay, take those ideas, throw them into a blender, just hit the puree button, and we'll see what happens. Screw editing. Because it's just such a fragmented, all over the place mess. It just seems like a just random smattering of ideas. Not all of them are bad, but they're just so all over the place. They're so weird. They don't make any sense. And the whole plot line of this thing makes no sense. And so, unlike the previous game, which made sense, it had a lot of intrigue, it was mysterious, and it felt like a true adventure, this one just feels like an incoherent mess. And as a result, the story is actually kind of irritating. So, if you have this irritating story, what do you combine it with? Gameplay that's a mixed bag. On the one hand, you have a more interesting inventory system than the previous games. 3D manipulation of the items. Yes, you can actually pick up items in your inventory and move them around in 3D and then find different things about them. That maybe the basket, for instance, or you can open it up, you spin it around a certain way, and oh look, there's a kernel in there. You take the kernel, you put it in some sand that's damp, and then boom, you get a corn stalk. Instantly. Okay, whatever. But stuff like that makes the inventory system kind of interesting. The problem is that the inventory mechanics are very underused in this game. And another problem is that, unlike the previous two games, where the point-and-click interface had the verbs, basically, where you would walk, look at, or interact with, or something like that, this one, you just click on things, and it automatically does things depending on what the thing is. So it's greatly simplified. On top of that, you have puzzles that are more nonsensical than the previous games, partly because the whole game is nonsensical, but particularly in reference to King's Quest VI, where everything was based on logic. This one bases itself more like the previous games in that it's more illogical, but at the same time, even the puzzles in King's Quest VII don't necessarily make sense all the time. From that old Sierra logic standpoint, it's just like, wait, what? Okay, whatever. Luckily, there aren't that many of them that don't really make any sense, but it does happen occasionally. And on top of that, you have the complete removal of challenge from this game. Why? There is no penalty at all for dying. You can fail, you can die, but you can restart immediately before you made that decision that made you die, without penalties at all. Because, I mean, you don't get any score anymore, and it just restarts you right before you made that decision. So you've got all of your things. It doesn't really penalize you for failing anymore, which isn't necessarily a bad thing per se, but in this case it does remove any sense of danger that you might have had going into it. It removes any tension that there might have been. On top of that, you can just skip portions of the game if you want. It'll let you choose what chapter you start at. You can choose at any of the 6 chapters, and that's fine by the game. It's just like, okay, you want to start on chapter 6? Go for it! You won't get any of the story, but you can start from chapter 6, and it'll be over pretty quick. And this is actually a longer game than the previous ones. So, it's a really, really odd situation. You have this presentation that just feels out of place for King's Quest, although it's not necessarily bad, it just feels out of place. You got this story that's just all over the place, and you're going, wait, what? Too many times. It's full of contrivances, full of these convenient plot points and plot devices that just sit there blatantly, obviously, plot devices. Unlike in previous games, where even though it might have been a convenient plot device, it was more naturally integrated into the game. This one just has convenient plot devices. And you also have gameplay that is attempting to be challenging, but isn't, because you basically can't fail anymore in the long run. You can skip things, you can restart immediately where you failed. It's just a mess. It doesn't feel at all like King's Quest. And so this actually really divided people. There were a lot of people who really liked it, and there were a lot of people who really hated it. And there's not really any in between. This is a game you either love or you hate. There's really not much in between there, because it's just so radically different from all of the King's Quest games that it will divide whether you like it or not. I mean, you might be able to find something to like about it, you might not. It's just up in arms. That's really up to you, basically. So, if you want my personal perspective, I can't stand it. I find the game just annoying and boring. And there are a lot of people who would agree with me. Meanwhile, there are people who would disagree with me and say that it's wonderful and fun and campy and stuff like that. I guess I can see that, but I personally cannot recommend King's Quest VII. Going from 6, which was one of the best adventure games ever made, to 7, which is just not, it was kind of depressing. But I will have a link in the video description box if you want to check it out. But my advice, steer clear from King's Quest VII. It's not very good. Thanks for watching.